Good evening.
Hello.
Hello, good evening, good evening. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm Yuki Miyamoto, Vincent DePaul Professor and Director of the DePaul Humanities Center. This summer, I was in Hiroshima, attending several meetings, gatherings, and symposia commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Yet, I hardly saw or heard any mention of Alamogordo, New Mexico, the site where the first atomic bomb was detonated. I would like to emphasize that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not the only representations of nuclear victims in 1945. Instead, I want to call attention to the roughly 13,000 people who lived within a 50-mile radius of the Alamogordo test site, conducted just 3 weeks prior, the test conducted just 3 weeks prior to the bombings in Japan. Moreover, with more than 2,000 nuclear tests having taken place on our planet since 1945, the harms inflicted 80 years ago are not distant history, but they are ongoing and they continue to shape our future. With this in mind, Dr. Anna Clissold, Associate Director of the Humanities Center, and I invited 2 guests, one from New Mexico and one from Hiroshima. We are deeply honored to welcome Dr. Gómez and Mr. Tanaka, representing Hidankyo. We hope this event will serve as another occasion to inspire us to envision and work together and work toward a more equitable and truly safe society. The DePaul Humanities Center is supported by many dedicated faculty, fellows, and colleagues. We are especially grateful to the Dean of the Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at DePaul University, Dr. Guillermo Vasquez Velasco, for steadfast support for the humanities and for graciously offering opening remarks this evening. Let's welcome Dr. Guillermo.
Thank you and good evening and welcome to DePaul. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this amazing program we have in front of us. It is always my pleasure to welcome our guests to DePaul. DePaul, as you probably know, is a liberal arts university. What that means is that our general studies program that all the students in DePaul take has a very robust presence of liberal arts courses. Now, we always say that DePaul is different than many other institutions because here we do. Here we're hands-on. And the way I explain this is that in the liberal arts, we usually wake up the awareness and the understanding of the world around us for our students. Now at DePaul, we do one more thing, and that one more thing is we send them to be actionable. We believe in the applied liberal arts, the ways in which we can make a difference in the world. Now inside DePaul, and this may look a little bit like those Russian dolls, nested dolls, where there is a doll inside the next doll. Inside DePaul, we have the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Once upon a time, the college was the university, and then expanded into, nowadays, 10 colleges. But our College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences continues to be the core of the university. It is a little bit like a small university inside a larger university, following on that metaphor of the Russian dolls. But then inside the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, we find the humanities, we find the arts. And that's where we find our center, our humanities center, that carries that responsibility to celebrate the humanities beyond our classrooms, in forums like this one, where we bring guests, bring speakers, bring the whole academic family of DePaul together to share on that understanding of the past, the present, and the future. And sometimes that future is very promising, sometimes it's a little scary. And that's a little bit what we're going to see today. There is hope in the future. And that's, I hope that is something you can take with you after today's program. Now, when I told my wife that I was going to provide a short welcome to an event that talks about the nuclear legacies, I told her, this is my one opportunity to talk about Godzilla. But in her wisdom, and I have learned to recognize that she's always right, she told me, no problem, that's not what it's about. Besides, we do have an expert on Godzilla here with you. So I'm not going to talk about Godzilla. I'm going to pass the baton to those that are experts in this field. And I really look forward to tonight's program. So again, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Yuki, and thank you to Anna for making your magic of bringing us together this year. Thank you so much.
Guillermo. And first, I would like to introduce our first guest speaker, Dr. Myrriah Gómez. She's from Paraqui Valley, am I saying it right? Valley in northern New Mexico. She is the author of Nuevo Mexico, Colonialism and the Effects of the Nuclear Industrial Complex on Nuevo Mexicanos. This book received both a Southwest Book Award and an International Latino Book Award. She earned her doctorate in English with an emphasis in Latino literature from the University of Texas at San Antonio and is a 2011 Ford Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellow. Dr. Gómez is currently an associate professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico, where she directs the Connection Spain Study Abroad program in Cáceres, Spain. She serves as faculty coordinator for the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program at the University of New Mexico. In 2015, she received the Faculty of Color Award for teaching from the University of New Mexico project for New Mexico graduates of color. Let us welcome Dr. Gómez.
Like Yuki said, I was also in Japan in August for the 80th anniversary or commemoration of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, for me, this was my first visit to Japan, but it was so familiar to me. And when I got home and people would ask me how this experience was, I had a really difficult time explaining and putting my finger on what was familiar. And finally, I realized that there were two things about it that made it familiar to me. One was the emphasis on the Catholicism in Nagasaki, and the second thing was that everybody there was speaking the language of atomic bombs, atomic bombings, and atomic bomb culture, which is a language I speak, just like English and just like Spanish. For me, the trip to Japan that I shared as a pilgrimage for peace with about 80 other people, including clergy, Catholic clergy, faculty from universities, mostly Jesuit universities, and about 36 students, both Japanese and American college students. This experience was To use a word that we use very often in New Mexico, it was a form of querencia. And for us, querencia is a word that basically means that you know something like the back of your hand. It is a word that has been used to refer to animals that when they are in their stables, they return to the corner that is safe and familiar to them. And for me, Japan was a very similar experience, particularly Nagasaki. And today I want to share why that is. So I'm sorry you can't see this map very well, but I wanted to start with the map for 2 reasons. When the Oppenheimer film came out just a couple of summers ago, and I was talking to reporters or talking to different people who were asking questions about the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos or in New Mexico, where I'm from, and I'll point to the map in a second. Actually, does this work? Test. Okay, I'm gonna use this instead. And where I grew up in New Mexico, one thing became really clear to me. I was talking to one person, and in the midst of the conversation, I realized something really significant. Because the Oppenheimer doesn't do a good job of it, I realized that people didn't know the geography of New Mexico. So when you think of the Manhattan Project, where the atomic bombs were developed, people think of Los Alamos. When we think of where the bomb was tested, which is also represented in that film, most people hear Alamogordo or they think Trinity site, and actually Socorro, and there are some other smaller communities that are closer to the Trinity site than Alamogordo, but I'm gonna talk about why we know Alamogordo better. They don't realize that it's actually 200 miles apart from those two places. So I want to point this out on the map to situate all of you in my homeland. Those 2 yellow kind of squares there point to where the first plutonium bomb was tested in southern New Mexico on July 16, 1945. If you look up, all the way up, and I had a square on here and I don't know why it's showing up, but you can kind of make out the word Española, and to the left is Los Alamos. Can you all see that? No. Yeah, I know, and I don't have a pointer. So if you go straight up, if you follow I-25 straight up, you can see Albuquerque right in the middle. Head north of Albuquerque, there's a pointer. Oh, thank you.
Sure. No working?
There we go, okay. There's Los Alamos right there. So when we talk about where the bomb was developed versus where the bomb was tested, we're talking about a little over 200 miles of a difference here. And so what I want to start with is talking about what happened in Los Alamos with the development of the bombs before we get to the test, and then I'll end by talking about why this is relevant today. On November 15, 1942, Oppenheimer, as well as Leslie Groves, who was the military head of the project, and 2 other people visited what is called the Pajarito Plateau in northern New Mexico. At that time in the 1940s, it was still called Los Alamos, and that place has a very significant history, including indigenous presence from the Anasazi people, the ancestors of the contemporary Tewa who live in that area, in the 8 northern pueblos area, as well as Spanish colonizers, settlers who came to that area and then were later kicked out of those lands by American colonizers who ultimately fenced off that area. And some of that was recovered by who was then Mexicanos or Nuevo Mexicanos, New Mexicans. And when this foursome visited that area, they didn't know the difference between the pueblos and the Hispanic villages that they were passing, but they decided that they were going to acquire that for Project Y, or what I call Site Y of the Manhattan Project. And this was the most central place to the development of that bomb, as many of you know. In his memoir, tell-all memoir of the project, Grove said that they sought an isolated area so that nearby communities would not be adversely affected by any unforeseen results from our activities. What most people don't know is that the area was not remote inhabited, there was not good transportation, a transportation route by air or rail. There were actually communities nearby, but because of who those communities were, we don't hear about that very often. And so approximately 70% of the private property that was purchased for Project Y or Site Y was essentially stolen by the federal government There was a lawsuit that was settled in the early 2000s in favor of the Pajarito Plateau Homesteaders Incorporated. There were over 36 Nuevo Mexicanos, Spanish-speaking families, who were evicted from their farms or their ranches without due process. These are my great-grandparents. They were one of the families. These Nuevo Mexicanos were not able to negotiate the valuation of their property. Some of them did not receive declarations of taking. Some of them did not receive compensation at that time. And this is why that lawsuit ended up happening. These families ended up being the workforce of the labs, or of the Manhattan Project, which turned into Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so because of that, right, because of that takeover of the Pajarito Plateau, they needed blue-collar workers, and they made blue-collar workers out of those communities. Now, when you look at the full list of those stipulations for that project, the only stipulation that that area met was that there was a reasonable availability of labor nearby. And so they start the project, and as many of you know from the Oppenheimer film or otherwise, or maybe you don't know, what was happening was that the uranium that was used for this project, most of that came from Canada or from the Belgian Congo. The mining that happened in New Mexico actually didn't come until later, and I'll get to that in a minute. And so after they developed the uranium bomb, which was a gun-type device, they were having plutonium made. Plutonium is not man-made, right? And so when they realized that they were not going to be able to use the plutonium for that same gun-type device, they had to develop a new bomb, a new weapon for that plutonium. And so almost a year to the day, in July of 1944, they stopped work on the plutonium gun device and started developing a new bomb that they would be able to use for the plutonium. What a lot of people don't know is that the early testing that started on nuclear weapons happened in Los Alamos, in Bio Canyon. This is a photo of Bio Canyon from 1950. The Pajarito Plateau is set up like a bunch of finger canyons. And in this particular canyon is where they were testing the radioactive lanthanum, what they call the radioactive lanthanum tests. Over the course of 19 years, starting on September 21st, 1944, the scientists in Los Alamos conducted 254 explosive tests. By the time they tested the Trinity bomb in southern New Mexico, they had already conducted 32 of those tests in Bio Canyon in Los Alamos. Los Alamos and Bio Canyon, as the crow flies, is about 10 miles where I grew up in a community called El Rancho, which is in the Poake Valley. We're the last, what would now be called Hispanic, or what we call Nuevo Mexicano, what the community members then called Mexicanos de aquí. We are the last Hispanic community before you make the ascent up the hill to Los Alamos. We share a border with San Ildefonso Pueblo, one of the Tewa-speaking indigenous populations there. And then you go up a very windy hill that my ancestors used to call El Camino de la Culebra, which is basically because of its serpentine way, a road that actually had to be altered and adjusted in order for this enterprise to start. So when they were conducting these tests, one of the significant pieces here is that those early tests especially released strontium-90 into the atmosphere. Now, because they did not, especially at this very beginning, early stage, they did not have a way to track radioactive fallout. And so some of the archival research that I've been doing recently says that they would send, after they would do these tests, they would send a couple of men in a truck with a handheld Geiger counter. They would try to follow the cloud. They would open their door, stick out the Geiger counter, or roll down their window and stick out the Geiger counter and try to take readings that way. And we know now that these are not, there's no way that these could have been accurate readings, right? So, because of this development of, this is how the plutonium bomb was developed, right? This sort of testing didn't happen in the same way for the uranium bomb, but we don't even know the effects of that strontium-90 on our community, our downwind communities. They actually traced some of the fallout just by following the clouds over 100 miles away in other parts of New Mexico. But many people don't know that. This is an image, my images are not pulling up really well in here, but this is an image of an ionization chamber that surrounded one of the Rala shots, what they called shots, which are essentially atmospheric nuclear tests, on May 13th, 1947. So this was after the Trinity test itself. So Rawa tests start on September 21st, 1944. By July 16th, 1945, they were ready for the full-scale test of this weapon. The weapon that they called the gadget. Yes, it is a weapon, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But one of the things that we talk about now, 80 years later, is why this test should have never taken place. Just like they had stipulations set for where they were going to put these various sites of the Manhattan Project, they also had stipulations for where they would conduct this test and the stipulations for the conditions under which this test could be conducted. Now, one of the interesting things is that they could not have bad weather conditions. It rained until 4 o'clock that morning. They should have called off the test. They did not call off the test. When I was looking at the archival documents, it was actually the diary of the geologist who was working on the project. And when he's writing on the July 16th entry and he's making reference to the people who should have called off the test, one of whom was Oppenheimer, the other one was Groves, who didn't call off the test, and he said that they were all SOBs. Like, this is how he documents it. Only an SOB would have conducted that test because they knew that that rain and that wind was going to carry the fallout from that test. The other really significant thing about that is they also set standards for how high those Geiger counters would reach in terms of rentigens, which were the measurement for radiation, especially used at that time. And those Geiger counters in some of these nearby communities actually rained off the mark. They ignored them, they waited for them to go down, and they never evacuated populations. So they literally broke their own rules that they had set for evacuations. This happened without any warning to the communities that were nearby Trinity. It happened without any notification afterward. As far as the public was concerned, they released a statement in the local newspaper the next day that said a munitions dump had exploded. Now, because this was it was on the very edge of one of the testing areas for missiles. It was a missile, it was and is a missile testing site, White Sands testing range. People just took their word for it. They didn't question it. Had people have known that their whole area was going to be contaminated, they would have left. It's taken 80 years for people to start to accept and realize that they became downwinders that day that the test went off. So if you know anything about ionizing radiation, you're not just gonna walk through and become super contaminated by that radiation. It's not the same type of effect or acute radiation poisoning that the Hibakusha experienced with the bombings in Japan. What happened at Trinity site and the way that it affected those populations was a little bit different. When we hear and we read that this test was successful, this test was actually not successful. It did not detonate the way they wanted it to. There was 10 pounds of plutonium that did not fission. It went up into the atmosphere and it basically rained back down. And so in terms of thinking about the pathway to ionizing radiation contamination or exposure and the way that people ended up harmed is that they had to ingest it either by breathing it in or they had to consume it. And when you think about who those populations were that were living nearby, these were small villages, small pueblos, to use the Spanish word, of primarily Mexicanos de aquí, Nuevo Mexicanos, and indigenous people. In fact, the early fallout map that showed the fallout from that test conveniently went around the Mescalero Apache Reservation. Now, when we think about those communities and those pathways and the lifestyle that those people were living then, without realizing the bomb that had just gone off in their backyard, right? They were living very natural lifestyles. So the way that we think about land-based peoples then and now in New Mexico is that we have acequia communities. Acequias are irrigation ditches that collect water from basically the runoff, mountain runoff, or another water source that gets trickled in and used to irrigate. We grow our crops, we eat animals off of the land, and so all of that ended up contaminated, and the people ingested that in various ways. And so 80 years later, now we have many people who have gotten sick. We have questions of epigenetics because their descendants and their descendants have gotten sick. And in some families, there are 5 generations of cancer in particular, and these are epigenetic cancers, radiogenic cancers that are traced specifically to radiation over exposure, like thyroid cancer, for example. It took the federal government 80 years to acknowledge the Trinity downwinders, the people who were downwind of that first plutonium bomb weapon that went off. It's a weapon because they weaponized this device against their own people and never made them aware. In 1990, the federal government passed what is called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA. They amended it in 2000, and it covers 3 populations of people. It covers on-site test participants for all atmospheric tests in the United States, of which there are approximately 1,000. It covers downwinders of the Nevada test site tests, so not Trinity and not Pacific Islanders who were impacted by atmospheric nuclear testing. And it also covers uranium workers until the year 1971, not after 1971. Does anyone know the significance of 1971? Nuclear energy. So the federal government decided that they were not going to be held responsible for any uranium workers that got sick due to their work in uranium industry, whether they were miners or ore transporters or anybody else who was working in the uranium industry. There is a coalition of people, downwinders, post-71 uranium workers, on-site workers, who have petitioned the government since 1990, since 2000, to amend that Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in order to expand it and allow those people to be compensable and covered under it. And that finally happened this summer in July of 2025. This is really complex because do you know which bill this got reauthorized under? Right, BBB, right? House Bill 1, or HR 1. So it changed the beginning of coverage to September 24th, 1944. The year 1944 is because of those radioactive lanthanum tests. So now it covers downwinders in New Mexico. And it also changed the end of coverage from October 31st, 1958 to November 6th, 1962, which is when the Rolla tests ended. The problem with expanding or reauthorizing RECA in this way is that it only allows for a 2-year period for people to apply for that coverage or that compensation and have it approved. And because there are thousands of people who qualify for this, it's probably not going to happen. Some of the people that I've been talking to lately, the downwinders, Trinity downwinders in particular, are having a very difficult time procuring medical records. One of the only facilities in New Mexico that treats cancer patients had a fire, and apparently many of those records burned. So it's just like one thing after another for people. The other ironic part about it coming in that HR 1 bill is that it cuts rural health care. And when you look at the communities that are affected in New Mexico, the Trinity downwinders in particular, or our communities in northern New Mexico that are affected by Manhattan Project and Los Alamos National Laboratory, these are already rural communities. And so we actually don't know how this is going to play out. So what I'm doing in my work right now is talking about, and I'm not going to give like the whole, let me take you down the path of nuclear colonialism. I can if you want, and we can do that in Q&A. But what I'm really interested in this current moment, in 2025 especially, is thinking about nuclear coloniality, right? And when we think about nuclear coloniality, and I just want to refer to this end part, it refers to these long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. So now we have 80 years of the nuclear industrial complex that has occupied New Mexico, and this nuclear colonialism has been built upon 2 earlier layers of colonialism. It's a palimpsest, right? 2 earlier layers, one being Spanish colonialism, when the Spanish came in and colonized in Yunque or Yunque in northern New Mexico near where I grew up in 1598. And then later when American colonialism happened, which we typically mark with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, when New Mexico became a US territory, and it took New Mexico 64 years to become a state. And so when we think about these now 80 years of nuclear colonialism that exist in New Mexico, we think about it, or the way I talk about it, is in these two halves, right? We can never pull nuclear energy apart from nuclear weapons. And I would love to go more into that in maybe Q&A. But let me just do this. We have what some people have referred to, and I've actually referred to it this way in the past, although I don't anymore, as the cradle-to-grave nuclear industrial complex in New Mexico, which means that we do everything from, in terms of the nuclear fuel chain, or what some people call the fuel cycle, everything from digging uranium and extracting uranium to burying or storing nuclear waste. This is a cartoon that came out on Easter Sunday in 2017 in our local Albuquerque Journal newspaper. And although it's a little bit off, I want to walk you through this, and it holds pretty true today. And I'm going to start down here on the left side. So that marks the Trinity site, which was the first full-scale nuclear bomb that was detonated in the world. And then if you go up, nuclear weapons storage refers to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. New Mexico has 2 of the nation's 3 nuclear weapons facilities or laboratories in the country, who are furloughed right now, many of the workers. If you look to the left, in the 1950s, uranium mining starts heavily in what we call the Grand Uranium Belt, which has affected mostly indigenous communities. Significantly, Laguna Pueblo, which in the 1980s had the largest open pit uranium mine. And today the federal government, by federal standards, approximates about 528 abandoned uranium mines. The problem with that number, I always put an asterisk next to it, is because there are a lot of especially indigenous workers who are working on this issue who say that they are clumping or clustering abandoned uranium mines together, and that's how they get that number. And that number is actually closer to 1,000, and this is on the reservation alone. That Manhattan Project site refers to Los Alamos, so this is actually a better map to conceptualize that difference between Los Alamos in northern New Mexico and the Trinity site in southern New Mexico. And then when you see those high-level waste deep borehole research projects, those have been shut down. Activists were able to stop those, but those were research endeavors to look into a site to house a repository for the country's high-level nuclear waste. Because currently, we have no repository for the country's high-level nuclear waste, but that's a different talk. Temporary high-level waste storage, that's actually not a temporary waste storage. That is referring to the Holtec site, which was it turned into a proposal for a permanent repository. About 2 weeks ago, Holtec finally pulled that site. So now New Mexico and Andrews, Texas, which is about 6 miles across the border from New Mexico, now those are no longer on the table for those sites. Spent uranium processing refers to actually that project got canceled. But when you look at the uranium enrichment facility, that's Urenco, which is the country's only enrichment facility in the United States. And then this is a little wrong, the low-level waste storage, it's actually not low-level waste, it's true or transuranic waste facility, and that's the waste isolation pilot plant. And I wish I had time to go more into all of these things, and I don't, but it gives you an idea of how New Mexico has been totally occupied by the nuclear industrial complex. And so when you think about, I love talking to middle schoolers because I show them this image and I tell them, this is what we call the nuclear fuel chain. Fuel cycle. Is it a cycle? No. And the middle schoolers especially middle schoolers, love answering that question. It's not a cycle, right? We erroneously refer to this as a cycle still in the United States today. Many of us are calling it a fuel chain now, because it shows that when we're talking about power, right, nuclear energy or nuclear power, if we start from the front end or mining, and we get to the reactor site, and then we talk about storage, spent fuel reprocessing, which we currently do not do in the United States, and final disposition, which we do not have in the United States, this is very much a broken cycle. So, what I've started referring to it now as not as the cradle-to-grave nuclear industrial complex, but as the nuclear fuel chain plus in New Mexico. Why? Because we have uranium, we have a full uranium industry in New Mexico. We have mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, primarily across indigenous homelands. There is currently new uranium mining that is being conducted across Navajo Nation, particularly in the borders of what we call Arizona now, but there are new applications in New Mexico as well. We do fuel fabrication at Urango. Like I said, it's the only uranium enrichment facility in the United States. New Mexico, or the PNM, Public Services of New Mexico, which is our main energy production company, serves especially Albuquerque, which is our largest metropolitan area, has up until 2 years ago been using energy from Palo Verde power plants in Arizona. It's the only power plant, there's actually 2 plants there, it's the only one that doesn't share a body of water, and PNM was getting about 10% of its energy, but we are divesting from that currently. We have the Holtec site, which even though that proposal has just been pulled, it has not gone away yet. We don't currently do spent fuel reprocessing in the United States, and we currently have no active plan for a repository, right? So when you think about that, which is sort of that slide I went over in the last one, but we cannot separate power from weapons. And so additionally in New Mexico, we have Los Alamos National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories, both of which are currently developing new nuclear weapons, particularly Los Alamos. In 2017, the Nuclear Posture Review, which is the federal government that at the beginning of every presidential administration gives an overview of the nuclear landscape. I love this document because it says that the United States is working toward the total abolition of nuclear weapons, ... several paragraphs later, and to do that, we're going to build 80 new plutonium pits per year. Plutonium pits, as I like to tell the middle schoolers, are the parts that make the bombs go boom, right? They are the triggers of the bombs. Nobody has made 80 plutonium pits, no facility, since the Rocky Flats plant in Arvada, Colorado, right outside of Denver, was shut down by the FBI after it was raided by the FBI in the 1990s for crimes against the environment. This is the most that any facility is now being charged with producing nuclear plutonium pits. Now, the other facility, so Los Alamos is supposed to be producing 30 of those pits per year. The other facility is in South Carolina, and that facility, Savannah Riverside, is actually not functional right now, but they are being expected to produce 50 new pits. They literally are not functional right now. So a lot of that development is happening right now at Los Alamos. And then weapons storage. So in 1945 with the Manhattan Project, the Z Division was created at Kirtland, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And in 1992, it became the largest nuclear weapons storage facility. Some people estimate, the experts who have to guess about how many nuclear weapons there actually exist in the United States, estimate that if New Mexico were to secede from the United States, we would be the 3rd largest nuclear weapons wielding nation state. We also have historically done and continue to do different types of weapons testing. We've had the Trinity test, we've done the Rolla test that I mentioned. There were also 2 Project Plowshares tests that were conducted in New Mexico, Project Gnome and Project Gas Buggy. One major concern, and I don't want to say worry, but it is a concern, is that if new weapons are developed, which is happening right now, they are going to want to test those weapons. And the question now is, where will they test those weapons? And there are other types of nuclear waste. So I mentioned WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. There's also greater than Class C waste. There is a 2.5 square mile mixed waste landfill outside of Sandia Labs in Albuquerque. It is an unlined pit of contaminated nuclear waste that is literally thrown in there. It is being monitored by underground by monitors that monitor the waters particularly. We have Los Alamos National Laboratory that has the Area G facility, which has all of the high-level waste that is being stored above ground. There have been 2 major wildfires in Los Alamos in recent years, and the experts there have said that if those wildfires were to happen and were to get to Area G, there would be no way to stop that fire, and they would try to throw fire blankets over it and hope for the best. And then, of course, I'm talking about Trinity Site. So this is what we're dealing with in 2025. There is an 80-year legacy of weapons development, of waste, of people who are still dealing with contamination and illness and fallout. And all of us should be asking questions about why the United States government is building 80 new plutonium pits and working on developing new nuclear weapons right now. And we need to be turning to people like Tanaka-san and the Hibakusha to hear these stories of what happens when those nuclear weapons are exploded in communities. Communities like the ones that I grew up in, the ones in southern New Mexico, and all of the people who've been affected by atmospheric nuclear testing as well as nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Born on March 9, 1944 in Yamaguchi Prefecture, Mr. Tanaka worked as a journalist in the regional newspaper in Hiroshima before joining Nihon Hidankyo, the Japanese Confederation of A and H bomb sufferers organizations. In 2024, he attended the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony in Oslo, Norway, as one of the representatives of the organization. He has given his testimony in several cities across Japan and France. This evening, his testimony will be translated by Dr. Norma Field, Robert S. Ingersoll, Distinguished Service Professor Emerita at the University of Chicago. Her most recent book, co-edited with Dr. Heather Bowen-Strack, our DePaul colleague over there, is For Dignity, Justice, and Revolution, an anthology of Japanese proletarian literature, published in 2016. She also supervised the Japanese translation of Kate Brown's Manual for Survival, a Chernobyl Guide to the Future. This book just came out this year. Dr. Field is currently at work on a monograph examining the social, historical, political, technoscientific, and existential dimensions of the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. Please welcome our second speaker and Dr. Norma Field.
皆さんこんばんは。広島から来ました被爆者の田中聡です。核兵器が人間にどんな被害を及ぼす、私はどういう被爆体験をしたか、80年間の私と家族の体験を語ります。そして、私が被爆者の訴えを、どんな訴えを核兵器をなくす、世界の核兵器の被害者をなくすことを訴えてきて、それがノーベル平和賞につながり、そしてノーベル平和賞の意義をどう生かして、核兵器を、諸悪の根源にある核兵器をなくし、世界の核被害者を救済し、援護するかというお話をしたいと思います。
Can you hear? No. Keep the mic close to your mouth. Okay. Can you hear now? Yes. Yeah. All right. You remind me if I start wandering away from the mic. Yes, I want to tell you about my experiences, my family's experiences as people exposed to the bomb and radiation. I want to, and then the activities we have engaged, how I've lived the years, how we have lived the 80 years since, and how we received the Nobel Peace Prize last year, and what we hope to do with that prize, what activities we intend to engage to eliminate nuclear weapons from the world and to address this, to eliminate the sufferings of exposed people everywhere.
広島に原爆が投下された時、私は広島の隣の県の山口県というところで生まれました。父が軍人で、父も母も広島で出身なんだけども、父が軍人で山口県に軍隊がありました。そこで父が勤務していて、そこで生まれました。
At the time the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, I was living with my parents in the next door prefecture, Yamaguchi Prefecture, because my father was in the military and there was a base in Yamaguchi and he was working there.
広島に新型爆弾がで広島が全滅したという情報が陸軍に入って軍隊からトラックが出ました。そのトラックに母は私に幼かった私を連れて広島の爆心地に入りました。
There was news that a new type of bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and so the military put out trucks to transport us there. So my mother took me on the truck, and we entered the bombed areas on the next day, on the following day, on the 7th.
母の実家は爆心地から原爆が落とされた爆心地点からわずか900メートルのところにあり全滅をしました。それで
So my mother's home was just 900 meters from the hypocenter, and it was completely destroyed.
で私が1歳を返した新型爆弾放射能がまき散らされる原爆核兵器だということがまだ分かりませんでした。だから翌日から軍人さんと一緒に、広島の町にこうやって入っていくんですね。死体を処理しながら入りました。
So I was a year and 5 months at the time. Of course, we didn't know about the radiation that was filling the atmosphere because of that bomb. And so from the following day, along with these military people, I was going into the center of town where where people had to start dealing with the many corpses.
この時に広島地域にいた人は直爆者といいまして直接、原爆の影響を受けた放射能を浴びた人たち、これが第一種被爆者は4種類あります。まず第一種類被爆者は直接原爆を浴びた人です。
So in the first instance, people considered hibakusha were those who and they're called direct hibakusha because they were there on that day.
第2番は原爆が投下された時、爆心地から半径2キロ以内のところに2週間以内に入った人、これは被爆者です。
And the second category are those who entered within 2 weeks of the detonation into a radius of 2 kilometers from the hypocenter.
私も母もこれに該当します。
My mother and I fall into that category.
直爆者が爆弾が落ちた時に逃げる人は逃げました。爆心地から外へ逃げました。逃げましたけども、私たちは落ちてから入っていって、中にはずっとそこで暮らしている人がいて、たくさんの放射能がありました。
This is an ironic situation. Those who were the direct hibakusha, those who could, fled the site, right? But people like him and Mr. Tanaka and his mother were people who actually come into the city, flooded with radiation, right, and stay on there working, or people who had been living and hadn't been able to leave.
第三の被爆者は、その時に被爆したお母さんのお腹の中にいて、被爆をした人、原爆投下の翌年に生まれた人です。この被爆者です。
The third category are those whose mothers were pregnant, who were bearing them at the time. So people born until within a year of the death.
第三被爆者。4番目は、この地域で被爆はしなかったけれども、そういう被爆者たちが逃げてくる。男の被爆地域から遠方の人々でも逃げてきた人たちを、大勢の人たちを看病手当てをしたり、何日間かにわたって手当てをした人、救護看護の人たち、被爆者です。
And then the third category are those who were not there within this defined area at the time, but instead we're outside, and there were many, many, as we can imagine, people fleeing the center of Hiroshima during that time. So the people, often students, who took care for the wounded fleeing Hiroshima.
このような人たちが被爆者であるということまで覚えていてください。
So when you hear the word hibakusha, please keep in mind that there are these 4 kinds of people.
だって私の母の
recognized.
だって私の母は爆心地から900メートルの原爆ドーム。
That's where the famous iconic atomic bomb dome is, and that's where his mother's house was. And this is a classic picture of the level of destruction.
先ほどのね、これまだ道路がないとき、もう死体、人間の死体の、動物の死骸、瓦礫の中を軍人さんが道路をずっとつけてこう入るんですが。
All the bodies of humans and animals mingled with the rubble that people
それはmilitaryカードの写真です。それは数日後の写真です。
A few days after the detonation.
私の母の実家はどこか全く分からなかったんですが、この近くに神社の通りだけ石の通りがあったので、これが目印になって、1日後に家が探し当てられたら。
She was showing a shrine and the tori because it was stone, it lasted, and that was how they found the site of his mother's house because it was level, and otherwise, without that marker, they wouldn't have been able to locate her house.
Tamaka. さて、私は留学直後の私の写真です。2歳頃の。
Me around the age of 2, around 1946.
私は肉体的に怪我はしなかったんだけども、3歳頃から唇の口の中に、原因不明と言われるおできが冬になると口内炎と言われて痛い出来物ができましてね、塗り薬をもらってつけるんだけども治らない冬に、たとえ心の春先にはこれが消えるんだけど、また次の、冬になると出てくるこの状態が私の高校1年生まで続きました。唇がこう腫れて悩みました。
That he, of course, he wasn't wounded by the bomb, but from an early age he began to suffer from, probably cancer, what we might call canker sores on the lip. It would start every winter was a time of dread for him. Doctors said, no, we don't know what the reason is that you're getting this, and he would be given ointments that were applied, never worked. Only spring brought release from this, and he repeated this year after year after year. And he told us 2 nights ago about how he used to bite into it with his teeth to get rid of the pus, and that left a scar. So this was kind of a dreaded physical event that was repeated for him. Really important to keep in mind, given that he didn't experience the bomb, the initial exposure to radiation, as well as the impact of the bomb.
先生が原因不明と言われまして、いろんな病院に親が連れて行ってくれましたけれども、同じようなことを言われて、原因不明と言われておりました。この話をまず後からしますので覚えておいてください。いろんな病気をしましたけども、この病気を覚えておいてください。
I can tell you about many other illnesses later, but please remember this one, and it lasted till I was in high school, and the fact that his parents took him to hospital after hospital, and they all said, we don't know the reason.
建物からついて私が広島を記憶していることで、最初の頃、私が、子供の頃、5、6人のグループでよく、この闇市といういろんなものを安く売ってるお店がありました。露天商が道路に側にたくさん並んでてるんですね。
お友達で行ったっていうか、近所の
子供たちとね、そこへ行って、お魚の乾物、干したお魚、これをね、かっぱり結んで、河原の上に入れて食べていました。ある夜突然お腹が痛くなって、苦しんで、そのことを言えないことが悩んだ、夜が明けたことがありました。
So these are the black markets that flooded the area in Hiroshima, where you could get all kinds of things very cheaply. He used to go with his buddies, 5 or 6 kids, and he remembers buying dried fish, not buying it, stealing it, right? Because he was so hungry. And then he remembers having experience of getting a terrible stomach ache afterwards, but it wasn't something he could complain about.
病気のことも並んで、お腹がとにかく食べ物がない少年時代がすごいね、苦しかったんです。それでこの当時各家の食べ物、食料とか貴重な衣類とかいうのは配給制度といって決まってたんです。方がそれだけが生きていけない。みんなこの法律違反の闇市のお世話になって生きてきました。
So the experience of hunger is one that marks his childhood. It was widely shared, and there were restrictions on food that each family could have, as well as clothing. And so all of them relied on these black markets to fill their basic needs.
法律違反をしないんだと言って頑張ろうとした裁判所の判事さんが飢え死にをしたというニュースが流れました。
判事さんが
飢え死にをした。闇市のものは食べない。
There was even news that a judge who had not taken advantage of the black market starved to death.
小学校は学校給食は粉ミルクでした。新しい分量で牛乳をこれで固めたところを熱湯で溶かして食感に1杯ずつねいただいてたんです。そうこれは私たちは占領下でアメリカがくれてたんだろうとみんな子供でささやき合ってたんですが、ずっと後で分かったんですが、第二次世界大戦で国際連合ができてユニセフというのができました。子供たちを助ける機関ですね。今もありますね。難民の子供たちにいろんな医療品とか食料を送るユニセフというのができました。ユニセフの第1号の適用者が私たち広島長崎の子供たちは難民の子に指定されてユニセフからこのコラミルクをいただいてた。
Yeah, school lunches consisted of powdered milk that would be dissolved in lukewarm water at school. They all thought that they were being given this milk. The donors of the milk were Americans, but he learned only later that it was UNICEF, the United States Children's, fund, formed after the United Nations was, and we associate them with supplying necessities to refugee children in Africa, but in fact, they were designated refugee children in Hiroshima at the time, and it was thanks to UNICEF that they were able to get this source of calcium.
それは私が大学に進学した20の時まで続きました。小学生の時、実はアメリカでもらったんだよって国連からいただいたんですね。私たちは豊かな国になって今日本の子供たちはテレビで難民の子供たちを出て起きましたりしてますけど、私たちはテレビの向こう側にいた私たちがいたんだよということを子供たちに伝えています。
So we tell Japanese kids today, children of Japan has become so prosperous, who might do collecting contributions for refugee children elsewhere, that he wants them to know that they were on the other side back then as the recipients.
私はこのコラミルクのおかげで今日まで生き延びた そして皆さんの前でこういうお話ができるのも、このコラミルクのおかげだと感謝しています。
I'm really grateful to that powdered milk. I think it's thanks to that milk that I've been able to live on to the present day and I'm able to address you tonight.
この頃、広島駅あたりでは、私と同じような成長と、高校生ぐらいまでの少年たちがたくさんいて、靴磨きをしておりました。
Lots of kids would gather around Hiroshima Station in those days, and how they earned money was by polishing shoes.
原爆で両親を失い、兄弟を失い、一人ぼっちになって、引き取ってくれる人のない原爆孤児と呼ばれる人たちです。
They were called atom bomb orphans. Their parents had been killed, their siblings had been killed, they were left all alone, and there was no one to take them in.
列車に乗り降りする大人に葉っぱの上に足を乗せてもらって、ボルビデで靴を磨いて、ワンコインずついただいて、その日の生活をしていた子供たち。
These kids who made their livelihood on their own, asking people to put their feet on boxes and wiping their shoes with the rags that they managed to collect.
この子たちをみんなが時々見て、私はまだ暑くても両親がいる。私の方がまだいいなと思った反面、すごいなと思って感心させられました。私はとても、真似ができないなと思って感心をして、時々苦しい時まではこの孤児を思い出して、今日まで生きてきました。
When I saw these kids, I thought, well, I'm hungry too, but at least I have parents. So I felt sorry for them, but I also admired them. I thought I couldn't do what they're doing. And he said he's kept this memory throughout his life. When he feels discouraged, he thinks back to those brave and determined boys. Probably not just boys.
この話には裏話。もう一つ話があって、実はこの原爆孤児に靴磨きをさせていたのは暴力団でした。広島は原爆の影響で暴力団がはびこる、暴力団が大きな暴力団ができる、暴力組織ができることになりました。これも原爆被害です。子供たちに仕事を与えたことはいいことなんだけども、一方でそういう暴力団がはびこり、闇の世界が横行するようになったのも原爆被害がもたらした社会的被害です。
And there's another story I want to share with you, which is that because of the disruption, the chaos brought about by the atomic bomb, gangsters moved into Hiroshima. Now, they did give the children, these orphans, work to do, which he says was a good thing, that they could earn money that way. But at the same time, they took over so much of the goings-on of the city, and he thinks that we have to remember that this is one of the social costs of dropping that bomb. 私の家族は5人家族で、5人のうち4人が原爆にやられました。父は軍人だと言いましたが、実は広島市の軍人、中国大陸で戦争中に、銃弾に倒れて命拾いをしたんですが、大怪我をして、実は広島の隣の軍隊で療養しながら勤めてたんですね。その時に私は被爆をしました。その後。 We're a family of 5, and 4 of us were done in by the bomb. I told you my father was in the military. He was in China before the atomic bombs, severely injured. And in essence, at the time of the bomb, he was recuperating in the base in the next door prefecture.
その後、母の後、軍隊からトラックで広島の被爆者を救援に入って、また被爆をしました。ダブル障害者です。
And so when we came entering Hiroshima on the military truck, he was exposed again. So he was attacked doubly in the army in China and then entering Hiroshima right after the bomb.
私の家族は知らなかった10万人が原爆でやられました。それで、今では直後に4人亡くなったんだけども、現在まで15人のうち11人が亡くなりました。両親も亡くなりました。
My family, that was a picture of his 15 family, cousins and
大勢で、1年に1回8月6日頃に法事をします。皆さん一緒に兄弟話し方が一緒に法事をしている時です。子供は、これ集まって子供たちは楽しそうに遊んでるんだけども、奥で法事をしています。おじさんがしくしく泣いていたのを私は今でもよく覚えております。
So this is every year around August 6th, the family would gather to, as in a ritual observance of the dead. The kids had fun. It was fun for them to get together. But for the grown-ups, of course, it was a different kind of occasion of sorrow. And he remembers relatives, an uncle weeping.
そのいつも元気がいいおじさんがどうしてこの意識に泣くんだろうと母に尋ねたら、あのおじはね、泣き情報っていうお酒、泣き情報ってわかります。泣く癖があるんだ。泣く癖があるお酒を飲んだらね。と言って僕に言ってたんだけど、晩年母が亡くなるちょっと前ぐらいに聞いてるのは妹が亡くなって帰ってこない原爆で兄弟の中でね、15人のうち行方不明が1人だけいるんです。そうしたの妹、私のおばがとうとういまだに行方不明のままです。このおばは広島原爆広島平和公園にある原爆供養塔というところにお骨が収められています。
And so he wondered why this uncle who seemed so robust was always weeping. And he asked his mother one day, and she said, oh, he's just the kind who starts weeping every time he drinks. And he believed that until eventually, much later, he learned that one of his sisters had never come back, her remains had never been discovered. And so that gathering together as a family was an occasion for him to remember this lost sister.
女学校頃クラス全員で建物を壊す作業に朝から出ていて原爆にあって全滅をしました。クラスを全滅してそれで、その骨が後から拾い集められてこの原爆供養塔というところに収められています。
Yes, this is a mound where the remains of many people are gathered. Perhaps the sister too, like many other high schoolers, middle and high schoolers, were commandeered to help in the aftermath and the cleanup, or were already, they were doing building demolition to prepare for firebombing, which of course Hiroshima never had. And so many whole classes were completely killed, and many of their remains are buried in this mound.
この原爆供養塔は直後に亡くなった14万人のうちの約半数の7万人が名前がわからないお骨が生きとってのないお骨が約半数7万人あるんです。このことだけで見ても原爆の凄まじさ残忍さがわかる象徴なんですね。ここは。
So what? Tens of thousands of people are buried, and half of them have never been identified. And the fact that you can't identify even half of the victims is another indication of what an atomic bomb can do.
原爆以外とはこれは日本語のようだから簡単に原爆以外の特徴を日本語で書いております。いくつか特徴があるのは全部再であると皆殺しだということを人間だけでなくて植物もあらゆる生物が全部なくなっていると環境20世紀最大の環境破壊だということ広島という地域社会がなくなっていること
Some of the features of the damages caused by atomic bombing is one is that it was genocidal, it was indiscriminate killing of everyone on the spot, that it was a biocide that killed other living things, that it killed it destroyed the environment. It was an ecocide in that sense. It destroyed communities, so sociocide.
都市のハードな都市も、そしてそこらに今、文化も伝統も、
destruction
community
of
も全部
culture,
なくなる。
tradition, history, yeah, and Earthside, it's a warning about the destruction, the total destruction of the Earth that could happen.
一番知っておいてほしいのは、私たちは被害を受けた中から、私たちはこのまま核兵器がなくなれば、やがて人類との死が全滅し、地球が破滅するんだということを予告をする出来事である。アースサイド、ヒューマンサイド。警告であるということです。
And most importantly, I want to emphasize that we take this as a warning of the extinction of life on our planet.
もう一つ、広島では14万人が亡くなっています。その後、今日まで亡くなった人は60万人。広島、長崎合わせて60万の被爆者が亡くなっているところをすべて。
It's often said the numbers that are given, 140,000 for Hiroshima and 70,000 for Nagasaki, those are numbers for people known to have died by December of that year. And Mr. Tanaka is worried that those numbers are circulated all the time, whereas in fact, up to now, we register 600,000 deaths.
その他私のように生き延びてきた被爆者、その被爆者も国からの発行している手帳を持っている被爆者だけでも今10万人近くいます。
About 150,000 hibakusha like me who have gotten health booklets from the state.
でまだ手帳を持ってない実は被爆者がいるんです。80年経った今も手帳、実は私も被爆者です。手帳をください。申請している人たちが1年に10人前後います。
And actually there are many hibakusha who still have not succeeded in being issued health booklets, who are 80 years later, who are still trying very hard to secure them for their health care.
海外の大使館でも手帳を受け付けています。海外の大使館でも受け付けています。世界で。
And that people can actually apply for them overseas at embassies.
最近では新しくコロニアムのあった地域も被爆地域に指定しようというところも出てきて、それが新しく被爆者に認定された人が5000人近くいます。
And as a recent matter, and this is really, really important, because many people think that the sufferers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the people who were impacted by the detonation in the minute after. And many people think that therefore the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibakusha is not relevant for test victims or nuclear power plant victims, but wrong. They too, it's popularly called black rain, the rain that fell, the rain out that happened after the first minute in many parts, both of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What does rain do? It goes into the drinking water, it goes into the soil. People then had no choice but to drink that contaminated water and to eat the foods grown from that contaminated soil. And so many of them, they're not considered direct victims. They're not even late entrants. They're outside these, I would say, rather arbitrarily defined, often into concentric circles, people who live outside and who have not had their lifelong, serious, multiple illnesses recognized. And just recently, through a path-breaking court decision, 5,000 black rain sufferers were able to get health booklets. That's 2021. The truth is, we don't know how many more there are who have gone unrecognized.
例えばさっきお見せした原爆孤児のように自分は放射能浴びてないけども一括にすごい原爆に被害を受けたこういう人は放射能浴びてないから今援護の対象になっていませんこういう人たちも含めれば原爆の被害者っていうのはもうまだまだたくさんいる さらにこの人たちの2世、3世、今4世の時代になりました。この膨大な人たちがいます。この人たちは遺伝の影響を心配しています。
Well, and the kids I told you about who were orphaned, who may not have suffered from radiation, but whose lives were completely impacted. They've never been subjects of assistance. And now we have second, third, and fourth generation of people descended from the Hibakusha who are worried about the genetic impacts.
私が何を言いたいかというと、原爆被害というのは過去の問題ではない、現在まで続いている問題、どころか将来にわたって続いていくマターである問題で、私たちの問題である。つまり広島の出来事は昔話ではないのですということを認識していただきたいと思います。
So what I really want to impress upon you that this is not a story about the past, that the impact of the atomic bombs has not ended. It's about our present and our future. It will continue.
私は東京大学に住んで広島の出身だというと、原爆の時はどうだったのか、原爆のことを尋ねられるので、ついつい自分が被爆者であることを意識するようになりました。
I went to university in Tokyo, and people would ask me once they learned I was from Hiroshima about the impact of the bomb, and so I became very self-conscious about it.
学生寮のお風呂に入っている時、そばにいた友達が原爆を映らないのかと聞かれた。
Once when there were communal bathing in this very famous male student dorm, that he remembers being asked by another student when he was getting into the bath, are you sure that radiation isn't catching? So this is what, 20 some years after.
原爆から20年も経ってこの言葉に私は非常にショックを受けて差別感を味わいました。
It was such a shock for me, and I became aware of that kind of discrimination.
それから私は寮の風呂に入らなくなり、被爆者になることを隠して生活するようになりました。
I quit taking my baths in the dormitory, and I began to live a life concealing my identity as a hibakusha.
私はジャーナリズムの世界を目指して新聞記者になりました。被爆地広島の新聞社の記者になりました。その時の写真です。
So I decided to become a journalist, and I began working for the local Hiroshima newspaper. This is a picture from them.
私と違う、一人一人違う多くの被爆者を知るようになって、被爆者の喜び、悲しみ、苦しみを共有するようになりました。
And that life as a journalist made me close to many hibakusha, learned many stories, and so I shared all their joys and their despairs.
体験を聞きながら胸が詰まってメモが取れなかったこと。
Sometimes listening to their stories, I teared up so I couldn't continue to take notes.
ある青年が、貯金郵便局を務めていた、金融機関に勤めていた青年が、同僚が一家全滅の貯金を着服したのを見て、ショックを受けて、青年の方がショックを受けてノイローゼになって自殺をしたということを知って非常にショックを受けました。
それはその青年の同僚が着服した。
同じところに勤めていて職員が一家全滅の自分の住むとこを見て、こっちの青年がノイローゼになって、この人は全然一緒にいなくてノイローゼになって人間不信に陥って自殺をしたという出来事がありました。
A particularly memorable happening was a postal worker who saw that a colleague had stolen the life savings of a family, and he was so appalled, upset by that kind of action that he became sick, and he ended up committing suicide.
その の被爆者が仲間を作って組織を作って、日本全国の被爆者の組織、日本被団協というのを作った人の、これは追悼しなくなった時に私が新聞記者時代に追悼しました嬉しかったんですが、私が被爆者の組織を知って、感銘したことは、私たちは自らを救うとともに、人類の危機を救おうと決意を誓いました。
So, something very important in his career as a journalist was to encounter this organization that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year, the All Japan Federation of Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers. And this was the founder, and having learned about this organization and this movement, he was very moved and impressed by this man. And this is, after he's died, it was like a memorial booklet that he participated in the writing of. That this organization seeks not only to save ourselves, the Hibakusha, but to work towards the peace of humanity around the world. Atomic.
私たちは人類の苦難の体験を人類の危機を救うために活動しようということを誓い合った宣言に私は感動しました。
I was moved by the declaration, the founding declaration, that we will work to make our experiences the medium whereby we will work towards saving everyone else in the world.
私は自分の被爆のことを隠して生きていた自分が非常に心の狭い人間だったということを反省させられました。
And what that made him realize, what that gave him was a deep sense of regret and shame that he had tried to live hiding his identity as a hibakusha.
私たちはもう一つ、私たちのような体験を二度と他の人に、世界の人たちにさせてはならないということをモットーに運動を続けてきました。
And we've continued our movement with the second part of the resolution, which is that we never want other human beings to share our experiences.
私は核自体を生きていく目標を見つけた気持ちになり、皆さんと一緒に活動するようになりました。
I felt as if I discovered the meaning, the purpose of living in the atomic age and began to join the activities of these people.
私は新聞記者になって、なんとか仕事をしてました。50代になって食道が見つかって食道大手術をしました。そして、喉の手術もしました。口の中に60代になってがんが見つかりました。なんと私が最初にお話した幼児期に冬になると出てきたおできは実はがんだったのです。私が噛んで海を出す歯の跡がこうやってまだついてるんですけど、ここにね、出た資料はがんですよ、これは原爆の影響ですよと言われました。
So in his 50s, first he had
食道がんもういっぱいあって、口の中が60代。
I told you earlier about what was happening to my mouth in childhood, and being repeatedly told that we don't know what the reason is for it, but he develops an oral cancer, and is told then this was caused by your exposure.
書類を役所に出すためにですね、いろいろ聞かれて、私は母が私を連れて家族を探すときに野宿をして川の水を飲んだりしてたことを思い出して書いたら、これは放射能の残留放射能の影響だということ、原爆症だと分かったのです。
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking about all the forms I had to submit to the offices, and I would recall that my mother took me with her in hunting for family members, and that they would spend the night outdoors, and that they would be drinking water from the river. And so, yes, he was told, yes, we acknowledge that these symptoms, your illnesses, are attributable to the atomic bomb.
私のように 較的低線量の放射線が私とは晩年年が多くなって、その影響が出るという統計資料があります。私はその典型的な例になっています。
I'm a typical example. There's now research that shows that there are people like me who were exposed to low levels of radiation, and that frequently that results in delayed effects, like decades delayed effects of cancer coming out, and that too can be attributed to that exposure.
そして私は今6つのがんを患って小動手術入院繰り返し通院をしながら、治療しながら生活をしております。私のように昔話ではないといったことです。つまり原爆の被害はこのように続いているのです。これからも続いていく問題なんです。
And so I ended up being diagnosed with 6 cancers. I made my life all these years in treatment, and I'm here today. And so I think you can tell from that too that this is a story that hasn't ended.
私たちの中の願い、訴えが叶えられている8年前に核兵器禁止条約という国際法ができました。国連でできました。その時の写真です。
This is a picture at the time that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted in the United Nations, a moment of extraordinary joy. I think many Americans have no idea about it. That woman in the pink sweater there is Setsuko Thurlow, which I know some of you here have met her.
核兵器をなくそう、世界の核被害者を救いもしようという2つの大きな目標を掲げた禁止条約ができました。
So let us get rid of nuclear weapons and let us address the woes of hibakusha everywhere.
できたけれども、肝心の核兵器を持った国が入りません。私たちの日本もまだ入っていません。
And nevertheless, none of the atomic weapons holders have joined this movement, have acknowledged, ratified this treaty. Even Japan has failed to ratify it.
この80年、核兵器を持った国が2桁になろうとしています。
Where the number of nuclear weapons holders nations is about to become to reach 2 digits.
今地球上にある1万2000発以上の核兵器が人類を何度も皆殺しにできるだけの核兵器と私たちは一緒に住んでいます。
We're coexisting with over 12,000 nuclear weapons that could kill us many, many, many times over.
世界には3000万人とも言われる被爆者以後の核と被害者が拡散をしています。
I'm trying to make digital exchange. This enormous number of hibakusha globally are also living with the ongoing presence of these weapons.
そして核兵器を持つロシア、イスラエルが戦争を続け、核兵器がいつ使われるかわからないのが進んでいます。
And nuclear weapons holders, Russia and Israel, are engaged in war, and we hear the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. 30 million, he was saying, 30 million, maybe 30 million hibakusha around the world. Sorry.
これで核戦争の話にしました。
ロシアとイスラエルがちらつかせる核使用を。
いつ核兵器が使われるか分からない。
Yeah, so we're in a state, we're living in a condition where we don't know when nuclear weapons might be used.
国際連合も誰も止められません。トランプさんも止められません。
The United Nations seems unable to stop them. Even Mr. Trump seems unable to stop us.
人類の残り時間を示す終末時計というのをご存知ですか？皆さん、シカゴ大学の先生が作った終末時計。
I wonder if you know this clock measuring the time we have left.
広島長崎の原爆投下から2年後にできた時計は 最初人類の残り時間は7分ありました。
When this clock was made 2 years after, started 2 years after the war, the clock's hand was set at 7 minutes. Humanity was given 7 more minutes till midnight. So that's 1947.
しかし、昨年の年末、私たちがノーベル平和賞をいただいたとき、90秒になっていました。人類の残り時間は90秒しかないのです。
And when we received the Nobel Peace Prize, it had shortened to 90 seconds. And since then, it's 1 second shorter.
さて、先ほど言ったように人類は危機の崖っぷちにいます。もう打つ手がありません。
Humanity is
打つ手がない
on
で
the edge
す。
of a cliff,
対策はありません。
and we don't really have solutions.
そこでノーベル平和委員会がもう一回被爆者の声を聞きましょうと言ってノーベル平和賞を出しました。
And the Nobel Peace Committee, aware of the situation, of how close we are to the precipice, said we should hear the voices of Hibakusha once again, and that is why our group was awarded the Peace Prize.
私たちは被爆者が何も手柄を立てたわけではありません。人類が危機に立った。この危機を皆さん、世界の皆さん、今の核危機を認識しましょうということで、ノーベル平和賞をいただいたのです。
It's not because we did something extraordinary, but it's because we are all as human beings standing on the precipice. And that is what the Nobel Peace Prize Committee wanted to look at and emphasize.
でも、年が明けて今年になったら、終末時からさらに1秒進んで、今皆さん89秒になりました。
And yes, and in January of 2025, so it was in last December when they were awarded the prize, it was 90 seconds to midnight. But January of this year, it was moved closer to midnight by 1 second, so now it's 89 seconds to midnight.
ノーベル平和賞の効果が現れていません。
In other words, we don't see any effect of the Nobel Peace Prize.
なぜでしょうか。一番私たちの話を聞いてほしい過激を持った人たちがそっぽを向いているからです。
And why is that? I think it's because the people that we would most like to be heard by, the holders of nuclear weapons, will not turn an ear to us, to what we have to say.
そして唯一被爆をした日本政府もアメリカに従って禁止条約に近づこうとしません。
And even Japan, the only country upon which nuclear weapons have been used in war, our government, following the wishes of the United States, has not been willing to participate in the proceedings of this treaty.
私はノーベル平和賞おめでとうと言われてもちっとも嬉しくありません。
I'm never happy when people congratulate me on the Nobel Peace Prize.
私は被爆者として日本国民として被爆国政府のこういう姿に非常に情けない恥ずかしい気持ちでいっぱい喜び半分と感想を聞かれるために答えています。
It's that I feel sorrow and embarrassment at the position of my own country on this matter. So when I'm asked about it, I say, yes, half of me is happy, but the other half is not, cannot be.
ノーベル平和賞の授賞式のオスロに行った時、オスロの若者と交流した時の写真です。この中高校生が被爆者はあと10年したらいなくなると聞いて驚きましたと言われました。
This is a get-together with high schoolers in Oslo last year, and they said to me, we learned that in 10 more years there will be no more hibakusha. That was a shock to us.
でも皆さん、私たちの残りの命を心配していただくよりも、自分の命が80秒しかないことを考えてくださいと言いました。
What I said to them was, instead of worrying about the 10 years left to us, I want you to start worrying about the 89 seconds left to you.
皆さん若いと思ってるけど、80秒しかないんだよ。
You all think you're young, but you only have 89 seconds.
そして、まず一番、この話になった一番の目標は、核を持っている国を1ミリでも動かすことです。
Our biggest goal is to move the nuclear weapons holders in the right direction, even 1 centimeter, 1 millimeter.
私は5月にフランスに行った時にマクロン大統領に戦争を止めてください。核軍縮のテーブルを5つの国に呼びかけてテーブルを作ってくださいと要望書を渡しました。要望書は届くとこまで行きました。
So when I went to France in May of last year, I said, I really want to emphasize that we have to prevent war and that I want you to create organizations that will reach a non-proliferation kind of program that will reach the nuclear powers. 5 of these he was organized. He believes that this reached their intended recipients.
先月、ニューヨークの国連本部で、核兵器をなくすための国際デーというのがありました。先月26日。この時に被爆者が演説する機会が与えられて、私はそこに行ってきました。演説する。
Yeah, there's a day to abolish nuclear weapons. I went to New York for this purpose in September of this year.
人類の残り時間は89秒しかなくなりました。皆さん、今にみんな被爆者になるかもわかりません。言いました。
And I met with leaders. I asked to meet with the leaders of the nuclear powers, and I said, we only have 89 seconds left to us. You may all end up being hibakusha.
核保有国のリーダーの皆さん、私たち被爆者と会ってください。そして、ここにいる皆さん、一緒に行動しましょう。呼びかけました。
So I said to them, please meet with us, hibakusha, these the leaders of the nuclear powers, and please join us, let us act together.
のんびりしてはおられません。それぞれの皆さん、立場、世代で、核兵器をどうするか、そのためには自分がどうしたらいいのか、核時代を幸せに生きるための、これは絶対条件です。一人一人が考えていただきたいと、一緒に考えたいと思います。長い時間いただきましてありがとうございます。
Yes, it's not time for you to be sitting back. We have to think together, each of us, what we can do to stop this, to start moving in the right direction. That is what I appeal to them. And I'm going to end my talk here, and thank you for listening to me for a long time.
This question is for Dr. Gómez. As someone who, like myself, has grown up in a world that is post the invention of these nuclear weapons, and to the point where it has become steeped in our culture, this idea of a nuclear apocalypse, how do you think your perspective differs from those like Mr. Tanaka who were directly impacted by the inception of these weapons?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things that Tanaka-san mentioned that resonates a lot with me is the generational trauma. So one thing I didn't talk about was how my family has personally been affected. I mentioned my great-grandparents, but my grandfather ended up as a laborer. He died of cancer. We have many generations of illness in our family, including thyroid disease and other radiogenic illnesses. And this is something that's very common across New Mexico. And I know that doesn't answer your question. I mean, one short answer I would give to that didn't come up hasn't come up yet, is the connection between AI and nuclear energy. And I think that for young people right now, that is a perfect way to enter into this conversation. Because probably everybody in this room has either voluntarily or involuntarily used AI right now. And AI is literally being connected to nuclear power. And so that, and power is connected to weapons. So we really need to be thinking about that. And I think that if a younger generation wants to be thinking about potential impact, it may not be in the term of direct hibakusha with direct impact of bombs, but there are other ways that the nuclear industrial complex and the fallout, cultural fallout that will come from that is already happening.
Hello. I was extremely gratified, Dr. Gómez, that you destroyed the fiction that there's a separation between nuclear power and weapons. But my question is for Mr. Tanaka. What sort of collaborations, if any, are going on between the hibakusha from the bombs and the hibakusha from Fukushima?
それはたくさんありますね。
There are many.
形態は違う。あれ原発の放射能漏れ、核兵器による爆発の放射能違いはありますけど、同じまず放射能の被害を浴びた共通点があります。それで私たちが、たくさんあってもうたくさん時間がいるんです。まず私たちが福島から学んだことは、私はさっき被爆者の種類の中で爆心地に2週間以内14日以内に入った人が被爆者という定義がされていますけど、福島では放射能の被害を受けた人は10年も20年も帰らないという立ち入られないということがされています。これはもう後から分かったことですね。私たちの時は放射の被害が分からないから立ち入り禁止の難を貼られてなければ、直後から私のように被爆地、爆心地に入っていて、たくさんの人が生活を続けて被爆をしています。福島で分かったことは、そんなことしたらもういけない。10年も20年も入らなかったんです、実は。福島地域のことが分かった。大きなこと。それでもう一つ逆に福島が広島から学ぶことはたくさん素晴らしいようです。
Yes, there are many collaborations, but and the thing that we have in common, whatever the form in which the radiation was delivered, the point is that, am I? Yeah. And the point is that we were exposed to radionuclides, and that is impacting us. Now we in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have learned this from Fukushima. That I said to you earlier that there's a class of hibakusha, the late entry, I think it's translated as hibakusha, who came in within 2 weeks, within a certain distance from the hypocenter. But we know that in Fukushima there are areas that people should not return to for 10, 15 more years. That is something we've learned from them. We didn't know that back then, and unless there was some barrier, you just went in wherever. And so many people in Hiroshima were exposed because they went right back and to resume their lives. Okay, and then there are things that we can share.
福島が学ぶこともたくさんあります。医療研究者、お医者さんが広島に入って被爆の影響の私たちが研究調査で蓄積してきた動画をたくさん勉強されて福島に持ち帰って活用されていることとか、これから被爆者の私たちと同じ手帳を世界中の手帳広報しなさいと私たちは言ってるんです。手帳を作ること、これは別に言いません。まず被害者をどのように救済していくかということについてまだ道半ばです。それについて私たちはまだまだ足りないんだけども、被災者同士が交流をして、研究機関が情報を共有して、援護に役立てていく、 いろんな方策は広島から学ぶことはたくさんあると思います。
And on the other hand, we have a lot of accumulation of medical knowledge in Hiroshima. There are lots of doctors and scientists who have been doing research on this, and that's something, and that people have come, experts have come from Fukushima to learn from that. So there's that kind of knowledge sharing in the direction of Fukushima. Another thing is that the health booklets, the medical booklets that have been so crucial for Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. We would like to see Fukushima people get those too. That hasn't happened yet. So there are a number of areas in which we collaborate. We have been able to share with each other, but it's still very, very inadequate. And we have to go on supporting each other and pursuing knowledge and practices that can help both.
Thank you.
Good evening. My question is for both of the speakers. And
Get closer to the microphone.
there was a call to action at the end of both presentations that we should look to involve ourselves in the nuclear movement that's happening right now. And are there any organizations or anything that are a good example of what can be done?
I have to translate first. Okay. お二人の質問で、最後にお二人とも行動の重要性をおっしゃったけれども、私たちが何か関われるような団体とか動き、運動っていうのをなんか提案をしていただけませんか?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I talk to college students, and of course I teach college students, but one of the things that we've just started is Students for Nuclear Abolition chapter, and I'm not sure if there's one here at DePaul, but it's an international organization, and one really great thing about that is that there is already material created, and there's opportunity to network with other college students. So that would be, I wouldn't say that one organization is better than another organization is better than, there's lots of ways, right? The other thing that I've been trying to encourage dialogue over is that when we think about the commonality between nuclear colonialism and the other things happening in the world right now, in particular the genocide in Gaza, there's no separation, right? And we need to be putting all of these actions in dialogue with each other and getting involved. I mean, when you think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, one of the things that hardly ever gets discussed is how vocal Black African American activists were about nuclear weapons, and we need to return that into the dialogue over what is happening across the world right now. In particular, I'll just quickly say that the nuclear laboratories that I've been talking about are complicit and complacent in some of the other bomb production that is happening for bombs that are being set and used, in particular in Gaza.
私たちは日本では11月来月に政府国会に取り巻く大行動を被爆者がいろんな団体に呼びかけて大行動を起こす計画を進めています。それで若い人たちに参加を呼びかけています。
So, for example, most immediately in November, we are planning a big action with Hibakusha and supporters to surround the Parliament building. And we're calling on young people especially to join in that effort.
禁止条約にありましょう。戦争をやめさせましょう。そして各国の、特に核を持っている国の大使館に、要請行動します。
And we're calling for the ratification on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, TPNW, if that helps. And then we're calling for the end of war. And we will be presenting our demands to the embassies of the nuclear weapons holders.
私はテレビでウクライナとかガザの破壊された町、逃げ惑うお母さん、子供たちの姿を見て、私の体験と同じように重ね合わせて、今私の体験のようにいつも見て胸が痛いんです。
And when I see scenes on television from Ukraine and Gaza of mothers running around fleeing with their young children, I can't help seeing my own experience with my own mother. And it's very painful to see that.
戦争をやめさせ、ガザの人たちを救済し、そして核兵器を使わせない、戦争をやめさせることは、訴える活動、このシカゴでも大学でそういう光景を見ました。そういう運動をもっともっと盛り上げて、私たちが言う核兵器をなくす運動に結びつけていく大きな運動をぜひアメリカでも起こしてください。いろんなデモも拝見しますけれども、核兵器を、これは諸悪の根源、人間破壊、環境破壊、気候変動、ジェンダー、すべての問題に通じる核兵器は諸悪の根源です。これは私たちの生活を幸せにすることのこれに大きなそれには若い人たちがネットを使って、例えば呼びかけて、結集して大きな行動を盛り上げる、このようなことも考えていただきたいと思います。
I've seen films, I've seen that there are students in Chicago, college students, who have called for the end of war and who have called for saving the people of Gaza. So I know it's possible. It's happened here. What we really need is to build on that, to call for the end of war, and for all of it to spread the understanding that nuclear weapons are at the root of all evils, of the destruction of life and the planet. And this kind of consciousness, please find ways to spread it and call upon your fellow students, fellow young people, people you know.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'd like to ask. I'd like to ask a question for Ms. Tanaka. Can I ask in Japanese first and then ask again in English?
Oh, yeah, that's great.
田中さんに伺いたいことがあって、アメリカの責任とかアメリカの立場についてどうお考えなのかを伺ってみたいです。なぜかというと、原爆を落としたのもアメリカ軍だったし、食料の話されてたけれども、占領期にその初期に食料廃棄をしなかったのはアメリカの占領軍だったと思うんですけれども、簡単な質問ではないけれども、アメリカ軍のについて田中さんがどういうふうに考えられているのか、その責任とか立場についてどう考えられているのかを伺いたいです。I'd like to ask you about how do you feel or think about U.S. positionality and responsibility in a sense, because in Japan it's kind of common to say that atomic bomb was dropped in not a passive voice, but it was the U.S. military who dropped that a bomb. And also about you talk about food shortage and starvation just after World War II, and one of the reasons that occurred is U.S. occupation force didn't supply food packages, at least at first. So I do understand that we cannot explain this in a simple dichotomy of a victim and aggressor, but I'd like to hear your thought about U.S. positionality and responsibility. Thank you. お願いします。
ここまでいきましょう。戦後日本はアメリカの占領下でありましたけども、ユニセフの前にアメリカから一応牛乳などの食料を援助されたこともあります。最初の頃、直後にね。それからアメリカのいろんな民間団体のいろいろ経済的、精神的いろんな支援を受けてきた歴史があります。そしてアメリカから民主主義、日本が持っていなかったような非常に民主的ないろいろ制度を日本が学んだという点があります。私たちは日本人は占領はされながらもアメリカから学ぶ多くのことを学んだことに、 感謝の気持ちがあります。
And yes, I did say that we got powdered milk from UNICEF, but in the immediate period after the dropping of the bombs, the end of the war, we did get supplies from America. And later on, there were private organizations, American organizations, sent us many things. There's also the other thing that we learned about democracy. We were occupied, while being occupied, we were learning about democracy. So those are merits to be acknowledged.
しかしこの80年経って残念なことがたくさんあります。それはまず核兵器を最初に発明したアメリカがどんどんとその核兵器を開発し、そして、世界がそれとともに核兵器を持つ国がどんどん増えた。このアメリカの責任があります。それとか私たちのこれは核を避けるメッセージはこれを根源として核兵器をなくせ、核の被害者を救おうということに対して、そっぽを向いている、無視をしていることに非常に残念に思います。
And yet there are regrettable things, of course, that 80 years have passed, and the American government, the US government, continues to, is bent on producing more nuclear weapons, and they turn a blind eye to our appeal to join the treaty on the prohibition.
それで核兵器を、いまだに核兵器を持つことが、平和のために大切なんだということを言ってることと、それから実は核兵器にもはやトランプ政権もアメリカの政治家たちもコントロールされる時代になっている。なかなかこの核兵器に依存している社会構造が変えられないような国にしてしまったことに非常に残念に思っています。核兵器をどんどんね、開発してきた。それで、私たちの核兵器をなくすという考え方に全然無視している。開発ばっかりしている。非常に危険性を感じる。
それからもうその次が。
それだけです。
Yeah, here's apart from the fact that the United, oh yes, 平和のために必要ってこと。The argument that asserted by the United States and some others that in order, for the very sake of peace, we need to develop nuclear weapons. That's a regrettable fact. And second, and the fact that having this weapon, having this technology has created a social structure that makes it very hard to break out of it. That in fact, political leaders, including Trump, are controlled by the structure that's been created by the possession of this technology.
かつて私たちがお手本にしてきた民主主義の国が、民主主義が破壊されている、破壊されつつあるのではないか。非常に横暴専制的な政治がこれ以上ひどくなるんではないかと非常に心配しています。
And moreover, this country that we had taken to be our teachers, our model for democracy, democracy seems to be being destroyed, and this country seems to be moving in a direction of violent, coercive authoritarianism, and that causes us enormous concern.
よく被爆者に聞かれるんですが、アメリカに対する憎しみはあります。ありますが、核兵器をなくすこと、核兵器をなくしてくれれば、私たちは核兵器をまず憎む。核兵器をなくすれば、憎しみはなくなりますよと。しかし核兵器をなくさない限り、私は被害を受けた憎しみは忘れないことにしています。
We Hibakusha are often asked if you don't hate the United States for having dropped the atomic weapon. It is true, there is hatred, but if the weapons could be eliminated, our hatred is for the weapons. And if the United States and other nuclear power holders, but if the United States were to move towards abolishing nuclear weapons, then that hatred would go away. But as he ended this passage, he said that yes, but I will continue to hold my hatred for the suffering caused by nuclear weapons until they are abolished.
昨年の春、アメリカのカトリックのパックス・クリスティという平和団体が広島に来られて、被爆者の皆さんに原爆投下の謝罪をしたいと言われました。私たちはあなたたちの謝罪も受け止めるけれども、あなたたちに謝ってもらう筋はない。アメリカ政府に原爆投下の謝罪を求めて一緒にやりましょうということで、アメリカ政府に原爆投下の謝罪を求める共同声明というのを出しました。
Last year, an American organization called Pax Christi came to visit us and said they wanted, as Americans, to apologize to us for having dropped the atomic bomb. And we said, it's not you that we are holding responsible for that act. It's the United States government. Why don't we join together in seeking that apology from the United States government? So they issued a joint statement to that effect.
このパックス・クリスティさんと私たち被爆者は来年アメリカ政府にこの声明に基づいて謝罪を求める要請行動をしようと計画しています。同時に日本政府に対しても禁止条約に変えなさいという要請行動を計画しています。
Next year, we're planning an action with Pax Christi to urge the American government to apologize for its act. At the same time, we are going to be acting upon the Japanese government to ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons.
なぜ80年も経って原爆投下の謝罪を求めるのか。これはどう過去のことを掘り出すだけではありません。このことは過ちを再び繰り返さない、今の戦争をやめさせる、核兵器を使わせない、二度と再び過ちを繰り返させないために必要な条件なのです。だから私たちはこだわって、まず最初に核兵器を使った責任をきちんとしておくことが、これから人類が生きていくために絶対必要な条件である。だから公式な謝罪だけはしてください。償いまでは求めていませんけど、そういう政府の必要を表明してくださいと求めています。
People might say, why are you bothering to ask for an apology 80 years after the fact? Again, it's not because it's something past. We think that for the first country to use nuclear weapons, for them to acknowledge their responsibility in an official way is essential for us to create a future in which human beings can continue to live. That's our goal. It's not digging up old animosity. It's something necessary for our present and future.
I apologize. I don't want to cut off, but we are running out of time, and I apologize. But I want the speakers to stay there and then conclude. And also, after this event, we have some reflections out there, so you have some time to interact with our guest speakers. So that's the opportunities for you to ask questions and interact with our guests. And in concluding this event, I would like ask Dr. Norma Field to give us a brief reflections.
I think I've already had a chance to talk quite enough. The two of them, and then in their response to their questions, have really addressed all the things I would want to have said. But I think in my interpretation or summary of what both Dr. Gómez and Mr. Tanaka said, one thing, and I'm really quoting the late, great Dr. Jeffrey Patterson, who died 6 or 7 years ago. He was the next president to be the next president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And he said everything related to the nuclear industry can be summarized by the acronym SCUM. Secrecy, cover-up, minimization, right? That nothing will be acknowledged as harmful. And if people start getting a hint of it, they will cover it up. And if at last they can't keep it a secret or cover it up anymore, they will minimize the impact. And so all of us live under that regime. Some of us have suffered much more visibly and recognizably. And I think one of the great deceptions that's been perpetrated, there are two. The notion that there are atoms that are good for war and atoms that are good for peace, that Dr. Gómez got at, and Mr. Tanaka also feels very strongly. That deception, it's incredible how powerful that is. And I suppose because people want to believe it. That there are, I know that was true early on after the devastation of the bombs. There must be something good that can come out of this technology. And governments and industry have run with it and continue to run with it. And climate change has been one of the biggest gifts to the continued outrageous use of nuclear power, right? Because it's not effective, first of all, so it's a great deception. But the other deception is the notion, this fact, you cannot be a nuclear weapons holder without gravely injuring your own citizens. There is no way that nuclear weapons can just be for any sort of putative enemy. And we saw that really vividly in your presentation. And that we saw that it was called civil defense in the Cold War years. And I like to say this because we're in Chicago, where students and staff of the University of Chicago took part in an ingestion experiment of radio fallout from the Nevada test site and simulated fallout. I mean, that is causing the kind of internal exposure that both of our speakers talked about. What happens when you eat food grown in contaminated soil, when you can only drink contaminated water? Well, you take students and staff of the university and feed them that stuff. That's a pretty direct way. This desire to measure to find out just how effective your weapons are, that goes everywhere. This is really one of the, not one of the most dramatic ways in which citizens are injured by their own government. And when they're asked, these students and staff said they were happy to contribute to civil defense of the United States, right? So this great, the lure of patriotism to invite yourself and other living things to be damaged by nuclear power. And nuclear power plants in their ordinary operation. Just in that operation part, we're not talking about the mining and refining and all of that, because that clearly is a multitude of opportunities on that chain to be exposed, but even during ordinary operation is exposing people. So we've been living with this great deception, this technology, and that I would like to know how to get people to face up to that, to start on the path that we all want. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for coming and staying, and please have some food outside. And I would like to express our gratitude to our wonderful speakers and a great interpreter. Thank you so much. We have more of these events, so please check the DePaul Humanities Center's website. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to Associate Director of the DePaul Humanities Center, Dr. Anna Kulisov, and Student Assistant Taylor and Chimai. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a